While the U.S. may lack a specific set of laws that address psychosocial hazards in the workplace, some have a depth of understanding of the intersection between safety and the law to actually make a difference. We'll talk with a safety professional who also brings an understanding of the law next on this episode of the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Well, welcome to this week's Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies that could reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. 3 primary reasons that organizations, at least in my opinion, and there's others who might support me on this, there's 3 reasons why organizations tend to get serious about hazards in their workplace. The first reason is that they have a stated or even unstated value, and they believe that it's so important to identify hazards, and that value is more important than financial benefits. And that tends to be one of the reasons that people take the time to create a safety management system, to bring people in or contract with people to help them develop a safe culture. The second is it's all about money. Some people will look at the cost associated with hazards, the vulnerability of the population that folks are that the hazard is implicated or that the hazard affects, and they just do the math. And they go, well, it actually would be better if we just dealt with that hazard rather than waiting for that hazard to turn into something catastrophic. The last is some people do it because they have to. There's a compliance regulation driver that says, look, we kind of have to do this. Either the federal or state government made us or the company made us. And the reality is, personally, I'm okay with anyone as long as the hazards are addressed in an organization. But today's guest is going to help us have the conversation about those situations where you kind of have to. So, Adele Abrams, Esquire, is an associate safety professional and a certified mine safety professional. She's also a licensed attorney. As the president of the law office of Adele Abrams, she has a multidisciplinary attorney firm that deals with all kinds of things, but deals a lot with OSHA and MSHA litigation, employment law, domestic law, general civil practice. And she actually has offices in the DC area, in West Virginia, and in Colorado. Ms. Abrams is a nationally recognized author and speaker, particularly on the areas of occupational and mine safety. And in 2017, she received the National Safety Council's Distinguished Service to Safety Award. And it's my pleasure to introduce to some and present to others Ms. Adele Abrams. Adele, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, and hello, thank you, and hello to your audience. I'm really thrilled to be participating in this because you've laid out some very important issues to discuss here.
Absolutely. And so the first question, so I start off with here's who the person is, here's what I know about them, but the person who knows most about Adele is Adele. And I think we'll learn the most about you from you. So my first question to you is, who is Adele Abrams?
Well, beyond the resume, there are many terms you can use to describe yourself: a wife, a mother. I'm a boss. I am the head of my firm, as you mentioned. I'm a passionate music fan. Going to live music is probably my favorite thing to do. I am a dog enthusiast. As I mentioned, I have 3 dogs surrounding me here, all of whom are rescues. So I'm a big proponent of rescuing animals as well. And they're likely to bark and chime in at any time here. But beyond that, I think I'm a bit of an empath. if I had to use a word. And that can be challenging, especially in the type of work that I do. It sometimes my work requires compartmentalization and disengagement from the personal aspects, and that can be very challenging. Um, I have always had a bit of that tension where, you have to be the attorney, you're the one kind of directing things. And as you know, I deal with a lot of accident cases on the job. Um, so I'm keeping business focused. And then, I go back to my hotel and cry at night over what I've experienced sometimes. So one of the things that I've learned is I have to engage in self-care as well. And I know we're going to be talking about psychological first aid and psychological health on the job. And that is something that has been really a long evolutionary path for me to understand the importance of that, uh, both for myself and for those that I work with as a safety professional and as an attorney. So, I mean, there's a lot I could say about me. You know, I'm happy to talk about myself a lot, but I think we have better things to talk about here. And, I mentioned the empath as a characteristic. I could also say I'm an enthusiastic dancer. I didn't say a good dancer. I just said an enthusiastic dancer. But for our purposes, I think that is one of the characteristics. It can be a blessing. It can be a little bit of a curse too.
Sure, sure, sure. So you mentioned a little bit about, again, the topic of the day, the topic du jour, if you will. The whole concept of psychological health and safety it has certainly become a bigger or broader discussion post-pandemic. Folks have kind of, realized that the emotional and mental well-being of folks in the workplace is just as, and I would argue in some cases, even more important than the focus we put on physical safety. When I say the words psychological health and safety, what does that mean to you? What's your description? How do you respond or react when you hear those words?
Taking it totally out of the clinical setting, to me, it means you feel safe. You feel that you can be, as the current thing is, your best authentic self in the workplace, and not have people around you who are judging you, or who are bullying, harassing you, playing with you, playing head games. And boy, have I worked a few places where head games were, the sport in the workplace. But it's also, and I guess it's something that requires engagement by everybody. It can't be just a supervisor who is in charge with monitoring how all of their employees are doing psychologically on any given day, because you might supervise 5 people. If you're supervising 500 people, there's no way you can do that. And it does tie in with fitness for duty. We're going to probably explore that. And that's really one of the things that got me very involved with this aspect of it, was going beyond kind of automatically blaming drugs and alcohol for everything, and not looking at the whole human, the total worker health and fitness for duty, for all reasons. And,
Sure.
We can explore that a little bit more, because I've learned this through other people's heartache, through handling fatality cases, where I later found out the psychosocial factors that really were not captured in root cause investigations at all, and should have been, absolutely should have been. Right. So, that is kind of, again, a bit of an amorphous approach to things. But coming back to the core, if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel safe at work, you're not going to stay. And right now we've got a huge employee retention and employee recruitment issue. If your company has a bad rap as being a crappy place to work, in your community, you're going to have trouble recruiting workers. Just like, as I've always said, mamas don't like their babies to go work for companies that kill workers. So if your company has a bad public facing track record on injuries and illnesses, it's going to be harder to recruit. Well, if your friends have worked someplace and they're telling you, boy, this is a hellhole, what a toxic environment, you know, and I literally spoke with a new employment client yesterday. Yes, it was a Sunday because that's when I get calls. And he said he quit and got transferred from a job that was 200,000 plus a year because of the toxic environment. Well, people at that level maybe can afford to shop around a little bit. If you are a minimum wage worker, sometimes you're stuck in those toxic environments, and that's when it really can take a toll on employee psychological health. And that I firmly believe can be a precursor to workplace violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As you're speaking, my mind goes to the focus that we have here in the United States on physical health and how it's important to make sure you have a fall protection program and HAZCOM and all that stuff. And in many regards, in many industries, we've actually gotten better. I mean, there's no question that the Occupational Safety and Health Act in the United States, it's made a difference. The issue, though, and the issue for the conversations I have around this topic is that the OSH Act was never set up it barely mentions, as a matter of fact, it only mentions the word psychological twice out of over 19,000 words. So it wasn't built to matter or to care about how people feel. And so if you, from a broad perspective, what do you believe the state of mental and emotional health in the workplace is in the United States right now? If you were giving it a grade, giving it your assessment, what do you think?
Well, we all know about the Titanic, right? The iceberg, the part that was visible, that's the physical safety and health. And we have largely mastered that. As you said, we've got regulations that cover every physical hazard that's out there. And we've reached a plateau on that. The mental and psychological issues in the workplace and the hazards, that's the hidden part of that iceberg. And that's the part that can sink your ship.
Right.
That's how I view it. And in terms of employer awareness, boy, are we at the very beginning. The inspectors don't ask about it. They don't, the compliance assistance people, they don't talk about it. It's like Bruno. We don't talk about mental health issues in the workplace because I truly do believe it's not out of a lack of compassion. But in part, putting the employer hat on, there may be a bit of hesitancy out of fear of invasion of privacy, in fear of, my God, if I ask the question and I get the answer, am I going to be triggering ADA accommodations? La, 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 don't ask, don't tell. I don't, if I don't know about it, I don't have to respond or deal with it. I find that under Family and Medical Leave Act, that companies very quick to approve leave because you got to have, wrist surgery or you're having a hip replacement. And then you say you've got to go into rehab, or maybe you just want to go in for, psychological well-being. Well, is that really a serious illness? You're challenged. Oh my God, you're an addict. Well, wait, you had a suicide attempt? I can't have you in the workplace. You're dangerous. And rather than recognizing that mental health can have challenges just like physical health, as an employer, you're hiring the whole person. You take them as you get them, but you can't throw them to the curb when they are going through a mental trauma. I mean, you can, they do, but not if you want to have good morale, if you want to have a longevity in your employment relationships. But I think employers, they think HIPAA, I can't ask. ADA, I don't want to ask. What if I say, hey, David, you seem like you're a little down today. What's going on? Well, I'm bipolar and I'm experiencing a change in my medications, and whoa, an employer does not want to know about that because they have to respond to it.
Right.
And they have to say, well, David, okay, are you feeling like you can do your job safely? What do I say if you say no?
Mm.
So I think it cuts both ways. Employees are afraid to bring up the issue because they don't want to be judged. They don't want to be thrown out. They don't want to be perceived as a direct threat to safety. And again, the ADA legally narrowly defines that affirmative defense. But employees, I think genuinely are afraid if they go to an employer and they say they are struggling with an addiction issue or they're struggling with a mental health issue in an employment at will setting, they may not know that they have the right to those accommodations.
Mm. So let's dig into that for just a second. The overwhelming fear that both employers and employees feel, again, in the work environment in this country, is a product of a lot of things. A lot of things. There is no one particular reason why it is the way that it is. However, can you just for a moment talk to the employee and then talk to the employer in that very scenario you talked about? How would you advise both? So if you're the employee, what should you or could you do? And you're probably going to be okay. And from the employer side, how should that be handled? So it's probably a little free advice today,
Yeah.
but how does that work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for the employee, the first piece of guidance I would give is, if you're looking at the federal statutes, if you even know about them, first of all, educate yourself. There is a lot of free information on the EEOC's website, a lot of really good information for employees, also on the Department of Labor's website. And the Department of Labor actually administers the FMLA more so than the EEOC, which deals with race, gender, disability discrimination. So you've got kind of two things going on. But here's, I guess, for the employee. First of all, know what your rights are, not just under the federal laws, because some of those rules have fairly high employee level cutoffs. FMLA, federal, you have to have 50 employees within a 75-mile radius, and you have to have been employed for at least a year, and you have to have been employed at least 1,250 hours. So, do we know that employers sometimes keep people intentionally on a part-time schedule to skirt that? Yes, they do. But be aware that local laws may offer greater protections. Even things like DC, the Family and Medical Leave Federal is 12 weeks of leave. DC is 16 weeks. Now, okay, let's look at the ADA. It's a 15 employee threshold. You have to have at least 15 employees in the workplace to be covered. That's federal. Prince George's County, Maryland, where my main DC area office is located, they have a county statute that prohibits discrimination on any basis, and it covers you if you have one employee or more, just like the OSH Act. So that's one thing, to be aware. Don't stop with that analysis at the federal level. Mine down, because there are more protective state and municipal laws. So before you even engage with the employer, know what your rights are. So when they tell you, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go, you can come back and go, well, under the, Philadelphia or whatever rule, actually, I can take intermittent leave for outpatient treatment for substance abuse. And as long as I am sober or clean, you have to, give me that accommodation. So having that'll give you more confidence in going forward. The second thing I guess I would say to employees is be aware that if your psychological distress arises from the workplace, that may be compensable under workers' comp. As I like to say when I do OSHA record-keeping webinars, mental health issues aren't automatically recordable or, on the OSHA logs, and they're not automatically work-related. If you're going home at night and you're saying to your significant other, my boss is driving me crazy, that's one thing. But if you have a mental health professional who will agree that your distress is arising from the workplace, then you've got something to hang your hat on there. And that may be a way of getting the time off that you need paid because again, FMLA leave is unpaid, to address your mental health issues before things reach critical mass.
Mhm.
Now if it's non-work related, you're experiencing stress outside, then you're going to have to avail yourself of paid time off or FMLA, or perhaps asking for an accommodation under the ADA. Maybe you need to cut your hours back because you're dealing with the stress of being a caregiver at home. Maybe it is situational, that there are times that you would need that leave. I myself have an adult son with schizophrenia,
Mhm.
and he rotates around where he stays. But when he is with us, I'm I'm focusing on him 24/7. So I'm stepping back from my work.
Sure.
Thankfully, I'm my boss.
Right.
But again, when I've had situational things arise when I worked for somebody else, it was rough. It was really rough. And how much information do you want to disclose to an employer, especially when you're dealing with third party uh, family members? But that's another thing that a lot of employees don't know. You are covered under the ADA, even if you are not the one with the disability, but you have a family member with a disability. So again, not only can you take FMLA leave to address maybe the needs of a family member, you also have ADA accommodations for that. And
Sh-
now that so many of us have learned that we can work at least in part remotely, it's harder for employers to come back and go, no, that's not feasible. No, that's an undue hardship. Like, dude, I was working remotely for 2 years. Why can you tell me now
Right.
that I
Right.
that I can't do that as needed?
Right.
And I mentioned this, the leave and the remote work, in part not necessarily because somebody with mental health issues themselves need it. They might well need that so they can go to counseling or reduce the stressors. But even somebody who is healthy psychologically, if they're being stretched too thin, that is going to have an impact. And so being preventative, just like I always say, the cheapest citation to defend is the one that's never issued.
Yes. Yes.
Your long-term maybe disability claims that the employer may be paying for, either actually monetarily, or they're paying for in part because they're suffering the absence of that worker from the workplace. That can be mitigated by allowing stress relief that may include stepping back to a part-time job without loss of seniority, without loss of your position. And those are all things really that the ADA was designed to have that maximum flexibility. Uh, but there's a developing body now of case law on mental health under the ADA, which we really didn't have very much of for the first, uh, 10, 15 years that law was in effect.
Sure. So most of what you just shared was kind of focused on the worker and the
Hmm.
rights that they have. And but you mentioned you have a business of your own. What would you share with business owners, CEOs, presidents, what have you, about, because again, what I hear, again, generally the excuse is it's going to cost us too much. It's all about the money. And there's a part of me as a safety professional that believes that you're actually going to spend more later if you don't do something about it up front anyway. And again, but from your perspective as both a safety professional and an attorney, what would you share with employers who are kind of reticent to do something about that because they feel like they're going to, quote unquote, get in trouble, or they're going to file a lawsuit against whatever the case might be? What would you share with them?
Well, first of all, you know, do the right thing. Just the legalities will fall in place if you are compassionate, if you are caring about your workers, if you see them as humans and not fungible commodities. They're not cogs in the damn wheel. You know, they sometimes employers, as you said, they're ruled by economics. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but one of the things I think that has fractured uh, a lot of our society is the fact that workers now are being viewed like commodities. And companies are saying, well, let's use temporary workers because then we don't have that obligation under ADA, FMLA. They're not our employees. They work for the temp agency. That is very misguided, by the way, and I can always circle back to that too. But when you're doing that, you're not building the relationships, and you don't know if David is having an off day because you don't know David. David was here this week, and next week he's going to be working at another factory, and the week after that he's going to be unloading pallets someplace, and I never have to worry about him again. That fissured workplace where we have an enormous number of people who are contingent workers now. Everybody's got a side hustle because they need to economically, perhaps, but you're not building those relationships. I mean, I do pride myself that everybody at my firm, I have known or has worked for me for at least 6 or more years. Many of them 10, 12, 15 years, and my firm's only 20 years old. So and some of the attorneys who worked for me came on as law clerks, and they've stayed. So I'd like to think that that's a sign that I don't have too toxic a work environment. But, I look at some of the other places that I worked over the years that were very toxic. And even leaving the temporary worker stuff aside, because that's a relatively new development in the last 20 years. I worked at some really, really awful places with very toxic cultures. And those were the things that got me to leave. It wasn't pay. It wasn't my hours. It wasn't that I didn't like what I was doing. But, it was sexual harassment. It was bullying and, again, toxic environments. We were joking a little before we got started about, salty language. But I worked for a large law firm before I started mine. And one of the managing partners in my practice group drank at lunch, and he would come back after lunch, and he would be standing out in the hallway calling people out, Adele, you stupid bitch, talking to his secretary, calling her the F word and everything you can imagine. It got to be a joke. He had such a revolving door of secretaries that even the floaters, as they called them, wouldn't work for him because he was so abusive. And then he'd complain that nobody could ever find his files. Well, it was because he had a different secretary every week. But, it wasn't just me. I mean, he was very hostile to all the women and minorities who worked for that firm. And I could tell you tales, but it got to the point where I was a bit older because I was a third career for me. I was a first year associate in my early 40s. All of the others in my peer group were 25 years old. And I became like the mother confessor where all of these women and men who were being subjected to this abuse were coming in, and what should I do? And I'd tell them, follow the process. And then I got called in. You're encouraging people to sue the firm. And I'm like, no, I'm absolutely not. But now I was suspect because and this is for real. My last review after 5 years there, the only negative thing in 5 years I had on my review was that I fraternized too much with support staff. And I remember when the person doing my review read that to me, I burst out laughing and I said, well, they're the only people here who aren't assholes. I mean, it just came out of my mouth. And, I mentioned this when we were on a meeting together the other day, I think, but the thing that ultimately triggered me leaving that firm was I was on a business trip and I got a call that my mom had died. And I'm an only child. My father had passed away. So I had to take care of it. And I was supposed to have been going from that business trip to another business trip. And I called the same managing partner to say, my mom just died. I have to go to Jersey to take care of it. And, I'm not going to be able to go to Dallas, for that meeting. And no, I'm sorry. No, oh, that sucks for you. No, anything. The only thing he said is, well, that's really, crappy. And how soon can you reschedule the meeting?
Wow.
And I was kind of in automaton mode at that point because I was driving from Charlottesville to New Jersey, just going straight without even, having any stuff with me. And I was just so shocked that I said, well, I'll get back to you on that. And, I don't think that it was fully formed in my brain on that ride. But by the time I came back from that trip, I knew I was going to quit and start my own firm.
Sure, sure.
And
Oh, yeah.
what I've tried to do since then, and was make my firm the kind of place I would have wanted to work at.
Sure.
And as a woman-owned business, I've always had at least equal women and men working there. At one point, we had more women attorneys than we did men. I try to have a good culture there.
Sure.
For psychological and other reasons. And I've had employees with challenges. I had an employee who, for personal reasons, attempted suicide.
Wow.
I did not terminate her. She got the help she needed. She was inpatient for a while, and then she came back to work for us. And I knew what happened. Nobody else at the firm did. It was just she was taking medical leave. But we preserved that employment relationship, and I think, really, I think back on that, putting myself in her shoes. If I had been calling my boss from inside a hospital setting, saying that this is what happened and I need to stay here for a little while, and if I had been told, well, I'm sorry, but you got some deadlines, either you come out or you're out of here. I don't know that she would still be around today.
Sure.
Wow. I mean, it was rough. It was, and it was not even so much the harshness. I'm almost tearing up now, and it's that was 22 years ago, but it was knowing that I was valued so little as a human there, and these were people ostensibly that I thought I was somewhat friendly with.
Sure.
So that to me was the big betrayal. It wasn't that they didn't say, oh, poor Adele, and it was just that total. They did not care about me as a human at all. And if you have a work environment where people feel like they're being treated that way, and not, granted, mine was not a dangerous work environment, other than when I go in underground mines, but, I was an office person. I think about translating that into the construction field. And as a woman, I got my start in safety in the construction industry, and then in mining, and then I went to law school at night while I was doing that stuff. So, like I said, I'm a little bit weird. And before that, I was in radio, and I was kind of a trailblazer. I was the first woman rock and roll DJ on that station that I worked
right
for.
on.
But that had its own set of I had the president of the radio station, the owner, insist on doing my review in his apartment, and I got in there, and he had a couple of big glasses of bourbon poured, and I was like, oh, this is not going well.
Wow.
And I managed to slither my way out of that situation, but it was very uncomfortable,
So I heard you say just a little earlier that it wasn't dangerous. And I guess I wonder if the danger at that time, physically, it wasn't dangerous, but it sounds like emotionally, mentally, psychologically, it was very dangerous. That's what it sounds like.
Oh, yeah, there was absolutely that. And when I say it wasn't dangerous, I was talking about I wasn't working around moving parts, for example, where if I was really distressed, that distraction, and, I've handled over 400 fatality cases. I can point to a bunch of them that I know these human factors caused the death of the workers,
Wow.
So that was what I was talking about. Absolutely, yes, the mental health toll, that was dangerous. And in fact, I still remember my husband making a comment to the effect, look, you need to do that. When I was like, I'm going to be taking my income from this to like nothing. He was like, yeah, but you're coming home from work and crying all the time. I was
Right.
like, yeah, you got a point there.
Right.
And, at that point as well, the money wasn't worth the antagonism. And, it was a challenge because I loved the work I was doing, but, I'm still doing the exact same work. And now I'm the boss. So
Sure.
it all worked out. And a bunch of clients came with me because I think they realized maybe it was kind of toxic over there.
Sure.
That happens. But, uh, it wasn't just me. Using that firm as an example, um, there were a couple of women I got to be friends with in that time who had nervous breakdowns, were hospitalized, one attempted suicide, and they never worked as lawyers again.
Mm.
And, that hurts me because, it was so difficult. And this was in the 1990s, for women to get hired at like the big the white shoe law firms, as they say in DC, and then to have it be such a hellish experience. Um, it really ended up being very much a revolving door for an awful lot of the women there, largely because of sexual harassment. And I'm talking about attorneys as well as support staff.
Sure.
Um, you know, it's hard for, and I don't want to generalize, it's hard sometimes for people to realize the absolutely gutting experience it is to have that kind of harassment. And I'll give another example. It's a little bit graphic, but one of the women, the support staff that I fraternized with too much, she was going through a divorce, and the partner that she was a secretary for had said, "Oh, the firm will handle that for you." Okay, that's nice. Well, that also gave them a lot of her personal information, including the fact that she was getting no child support and was really struggling. And this was another partner. They had a big alcoholism and drug issue at this firm, I might add, back in the 90s. And he came back drunk after lunch, and he went to the secretary and he dangled $100 bill under her nose, and he goes, "I know you're struggling right now. This is yours if you blow me." And he dropped it on her desk and walked away. And she had so much stress on her. She just dissolved. She quit on the spot without a job to go to. Came down to my office because we got to be friends, and told me what happened. I was like, oh my God. And, but I got it. And, she did, fortunately for her, find another job right away because she had wicked good skills. But, she jumped off that cliff without a parachute.
Mm.
And, I think back, we hear so much about, families, murder, suicides of parents and children. And, I look at that as like a microcosm. Obviously, nothing disastrous happened. But what would happen to a woman in that situation who's supporting two very young children? The dad has, noped on out of here. She's now lost her lawyer for her divorce case. She's now lost her job and all health benefits. When we do, and when law enforcement investigates these cases, do they even look at those kind of factors? And again, thankfully, that was one that was averted, and I was glad that day to be there with her, and to be able to talk to her. And, she was in a program of recovery too. And I talked to her a bit about that. And I went with her to a meeting right from work. I just left in the middle of the day because I knew that there was a lunchtime meeting of the type that she attended. And we went together. And those kind of things, those kind of interventions. But, it saddens me. I wasn't even somebody that she worked for directly. I was on another floor. It just so happened we had gotten to know each other because we had a mutual friend who was a musician, but for that, I wouldn't have been there as a resource for her that day. I still wonder what that outcome could have been in another situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you, a couple of threads throughout these examples that you've shared is the importance of the relationships that you develop with the people that you work with, to be able to draw on that relationship in a challenging time. And again, in your bio and resume, we talked about the fact that you started off as a safety professional, and then the mining, and then the law degree. Let's go all the way back to as a safety professional. Talk about how important it is to have effective working relationships from a safety perspective, to be able to be available to people. Could you share with that for some safety professionals who may be listening in?
Well, as we've been talking about, you have to consider the whole person. And, if you're a safety professional, but you have that safety cop mentality, and you're walking through with blinders on, just looking for missing guards and, bushings that are pulled out, and, somebody who may be, working too close to something, but you're not perceiving them and really getting to know them, you're going to miss some of the precursors. We talk a lot about fitness for duty. And again, I think safety professionals, not because they're not caring people, because I think we, as a general, thing, we tend to go into this field because we do care about people. We don't go in there because we want to make a lot of money usually.
Right. Certainly not that.
But, even if it's not in the rule book, we have to look outside of that, because, as I said, those are the factors that I think are contributing to accidents. It's very glib for safety professionals to say, well, it's 20%, unsafe conditions and 80% unsafe acts. And the safety professionals don't do this so much. The bosses, and the evil bosses, tend to say, well, blame the victim. You come to that first root cause. They didn't put the guard back on, and then, they energize the equipment. They were just stupid. They were dumb. They need to be fired. They don't look at why did they think it was okay to take that shortcut? Was there a training deficiency? Was there a supervision deficiency? Was the supervisor talking the talk but not walking the walk? Was there production pressure?
Right.
All of these things, which can cause mental health stress on the job. I mean, if you're working in a piecemeal environment, sometimes safety does get jettisoned at the altar of production.
Sure.
And, people get hurt.
Yes.
But from the safety professional's perspective, one of the things I would say is, again, not only getting to know your people, but if somebody is acting off for them, don't assume automatically that it's alcohol or drugs. And I do, as you know, a lot of speaking on medical cannabis and issues of that type in the workplace. And there is a federal case from a few years ago, where the employer was forced to pay, I believe it was $1.8 million. And the supervisor was overseeing an older woman who worked there. She cried at work after being disciplined. And they said that was a sign of her being impaired. And they sent her for drug testing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, there was, if I guarantee, maybe I'm overextending here, but, I would say if you interviewed 100 women and said, have you ever cried at work due to something that happened at work? The vast majority, I won't say 100%, but probably, upwards of 80% are going to say, yeah. We might not have burst into tears at our workstation.
Right.
How many times have we gone in the bathroom to cry?
Yeah.
Gone to our car.
Absolutely. And frankly, I would say that a lot of the men some men do cry, because I certainly do, but those who didn't ended up with worse problems anyway, because they went to the bar after work. They went and drowned their sorrows, in a fifth or whatever, and probably should have cried. It would have been healthier.
Or they went out to their car and they came back with their gun.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, I think back, I can't remember because we've had so many damn mass shootings, but there was one I believe it was in San Francisco, it was in California, at a transit center.
Would have been San Jose, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was a while ago. And the gentleman who did the shooting, it came out, and it wasn't mentioned much in the press, but it was in one of the articles I read. He was, I believe, Middle Eastern, and he had been repeatedly harassed and bullied on the job. I'm absolutely not saying that it justifies taking other workers' lives, or any kind of violence. But, how many precursors were missed there?
That's right. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's part of my journey to get to studying psychosocial hazard mitigation. Started back with researching bullying, violence, the connection in the workplace, and that type of thing. And I'm absolutely convinced that there's a connection, and that there are these hints. There are things that happen that are observable, words that people say you can hear, that they're leading you down that road. But because we don't pay attention to them, or we disregard them, we just move on to something else. And we end up with some sort of horrific, thing that makes the news. And this started weeks or months or even years ago, and we could have done something about it. So it leads me to the fact that there's conversation, I think in California, other places around the country, about these workplace violence standards for healthcare workers. And so what is your thought about some of the gaps that we have regarding workplace violence type, legislation, laws around bullying? And what I say about our country when compared to a lot of other places, we really don't have the safety net or the foundation of regulation that we should have, that, again, almost forces people to pay attention at the lowest level. So if you had the magic wand and could, sit those, lawmakers down and tell them what they need to do, what would you suggest?
Well, you may have opened Pandora's box here, and with apologies to my employers who I represent, I am a safety first person, and I tell a lot of hard truths to my clients anyway. Here's what I'm going to say. First of all, workplace violence is the number one cause of death for women in the workplace in the U.S. Think about that. It's not guards, it's not falls, it's not trenching, it's not electrocutions. It's workplace violence, and 15% of workplace violence is coworker on coworker. That is the sweet spot that employers have control over. Yes, they can control invasions, from malfeasant, criminals by hardening security to the workplace. Yes, a lot of women are assaulted and killed in the workplace by domestic violence that spills over. But here's another thing. The majority of women who are subject, to violence in the workplace end up leaving their job within the year, and there's actually been a trend in the States now, and to me, it's just horrifying that they even have to codify this, that it's illegal to fire a woman or anyone because they are the victim of domestic violence, and they alert their employer to it. I mean, the answer is the workplace needs to be the safe place, and if you are a woman, and I have in my first marriage, and my first husband has passed now, so I'll talk about it, but I was a domestic violence victim, and I had to leave my home. And my workplace was my safe space, but it's also where your abuser knows you are. So what are you supposed to do? You're living in a shelter, or I was couch surfing. You're not supposed to go to work now because it might spill over there. So now New Jersey and a few states, Maryland is another one, have passed laws saying you cannot terminate a worker because they notify you that they have an enforceable protective order. You know, because otherwise, if you went to your boss and said, "Hey, you can't let them in," it's like, well, I don't want your baby mama drama spilling over into my workplace.
Sure.
And unfortunately, it does sometimes. I mean, in again, the mall that I shopped at in my near my home, there was a woman working at a retail store there, and her estranged husband came in, squirted lighter fluid on her, and set her on fire in the store.
Wow.
And she
Wow.
lived. I mean, there's a Washington Post article following up on her, but horribly scarred all over her face, and but I think about those situations. Yes, I feel for the employer, you don't want to have crazy people coming in motivated by that. But boy, you've got to protect your workers, and you've got to give effect to protective orders as well. There was another case in Maryland a number of years ago where the estranged husband had a protective order. The wife worked in the company. The husband came and talked to the security guard who he knew, from having visited his wife there before times. And he was like, "Oh man, look, Dave, just let me up. I just want to talk to her." "Okay, well, just ask her to come down, And I think he had flowers or something. The security guard called and said, "You've got a visitor." She came down. As soon as she got down there, the husband pulled a gun, kidnapped her at gunpoint, raped her. And I honestly can't remember now if he killed her or he just nearly beat her to death. But and the employer, they had liability there.
Wow.
Because they knew that she had a protective order, and it was their security guard who allowed, that confrontation to occur.
Sure. Sure.
So that's another issue. But what I would say is you can't discriminate against your workers because they are the subject of threats, whether they be threats from coworkers or they be threats from third parties. Now, this is the long answer to your question. No, I do not think the workplace violence rule that OSHA is working on right now should be limited to healthcare and social services. It can happen everywhere. I have handled workplace violence cases, where women were raped with an object at a college.
Wow.
By one of the professional staff.
Wow. Wow.
I have had construction sites. A woman was raped, and I know I keep talking about rape here, but it's an obvious workplace violence thing, in a porta potty.
Wow.
Shouldn't OSHA have some jurisdiction over that?
Sure.
Other than the general duty clause? Shouldn't there be some training and protection for workers in other industries? Because boy, if we had a 4-hour podcast, I could pull up examples of things from a variety of industries. And I go to this, look at all the mass shootings that we've had. A school is someone's workplace. A church is someone's workplace. A synagogue is someone's workplace.
It is.
A hospital is someone's workplace. A Walmart is somebody's workplace. A mall is somebody's. Food court is somebody's workplace. Even the parade, there were people on duty there cleaning up.
Yes.
Are they all workers traumatized by that workplace violence? Damn straight they are.
They are.
So why are we only focusing on hospitals? Why are we only focusing on social services? Sure. And Cal OSHA, is looking at a broadened rule. I think that's great. The unions, hey, folks, you've got somebody at the Department of Labor right now who hears you.
Sure.
The head of OSHA hears you. If there was ever a time to ask for broadening of these protections, this is that hour. Absolutely. It may not come again.
Right. So as we're wrapping up our conversation, tell me a little bit about an area from a emotional, mental health, psychological safety perspective where you're encouraged It looks like something's happening there, and it could get better. What's an area where you think there's some real positive things going on?
Let's be positive here. Well, the first thing is, I think there is more awareness of total worker health issues. I'll give a shout out to my friends over at NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They actually trademarked the word cloud of total worker health. And yes, it has 10 silos and 75 elements. And a lot of them are outside the wheelhouse of the OHS professional or even the HR professional. But there's a synergy between all of them. Everything from onboarding to retirement and pension, taking care of your workers once they leave your care. And I say care intentionally. I do feel an obligation, a duty of care. We have a general freaking duty of care. It's Section 5A1 of the OSH Act,
right?
And that isn't just caring for whether they come home with all their fingers and toes. It's also caring whether they come home okay in the heart, in the mind, in the soul.
Right.
So total worker health, that is a big step forward. There had been an effort to codify that in an ANSI standard. They took a step back from that, and I understand the concern was OSHA might use that for enforcement purposes. ISO, they have their 45,001, I believe it is, on mental health in the workplace.
Actually, 45,003.
45,003.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that was why I was asking you.
Sure.
And that is also focusing now. Is the mom and pop grocery following those? No, they don't even know what OSHA stands for until they get their first inspection. But the multinational companies are going to be driving this because, other countries are better educated on us than this. Canada, our neighbors to the north, they're ahead of us on workplace violence as well as on mental health in the workplace awareness. And so, they will be driving that. I would like to think the ESG movement will drive that because you're looking at, the care and feeding of your workers, DEI issues, as well as all types of compliance, including HR, which would cover ADA issues and accommodation. So that is driving it a little bit as well. And, I think the safety professionals, we have a job to do here. We carry the message on other aspects of safety. We need to integrate this in. And I'll tell a very quick personal story on this, which is during the pandemic, I felt the need to do some things beyond work, to keep me engaged mentally and otherwise. And I got involved volunteering for a group called Respond Delaware. I live in Delaware and work remotely. And I ended up, through various set of things, becoming involved with this group called Delaware BEST, which is Behavioral and Emotional Support Team. So I get deployed on a variety of natural disasters and COVID-related things as well. But to do that, in order for them to trust me around humans, I had to go through a psychological first aid training course, as well as a core crisis counseling course. And I'll tell you, those were two of the best things I've ever done for myself, as well as, for those that I do training for. And although I am a lawyer, I do a lot of proactive training, program development, and mind safety training. So I have been integrating psychological first aid training into all of my annual refresher training courses that I teach now in the mind safety and health area. I've been encouraging it and trying to speak on it when I do training for some of my construction clients as well. I've been writing on it because I am a writer. I do columns. And, I just did a presentation circling back to my Delaware BEST group. Literally, I did a webinar this week on how to carry the PFA, as we call it, not PSA, but PFA, psychological first aid message, to workers and employers as part of our outreach. Because we deal with crisis response, but the easiest crisis to prevent is the one that's never happening,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
You
That's right.
know, and
Absolutely.
and so I may be right now in my role with Respond Delaware. I'm, when there's a hurricane and flooding, I'm dealing with the people who are in crisis there. I was filling in at the hospital when they had non-clinical worker shortages due to COVID. And I just to give you an example, the 2 days before I showed up to do that at Christiana Hospital, they had to call the police because of visitors who were so distraught. And I only volunteered a few times up there, but we never had to call the police. I felt like the skills I got in that training, I was able to diffuse the situations. And that did happen. We had to turn away a young man whose father was dying because literally there was only one visitor allowed, and his brother beat him there.
Mm, mm,
And he was ready to go, ballistic,
mm.
definitely. He went out to his car and came back, and he was clenching the jaw and clenching the fist, and I was like, oh, here we go. But,
Right. Right.
I got out from behind the desk. I went over, I talked with him for a bit. I offered, to call up and see whether we could get his brother to come down so he could go up. And,
Sure.
eventually,
Sure.
being solutions oriented, but trying to be calm. And one of the key things in psychological first aid, they call reflective listening.
Mm.
And think about that in the workplace. How often do we really do reflective listening?
That's right. That's right.
So that's a skill set I would recommend, on a positive note for safety and health professionals, as well as for general supervisors. There's these free courses out there and low cost. I liked what I got through the state of Delaware in the free training so much. I took a low cost course, 7-week, 7-module with Johns Hopkins, a certificate program on psychological first aid. There are a lot of these programs out there, but, aspirationally, if anybody is listening, I'd like to see this be integrated more into occupational safety and health.
Absolutely.
Educational programs.
Absolutely.
Not just at the terminal degree level.
Yes.
But all the way down.
Absolutely.
Because we can't just look at half of the worker. We can't just look at the physical side. We have to take the worker as we find them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if there are folks who have been listening in or watching and they, that Adele Abrams lady really got them enthused and they want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
I have a pretty easy email. It is safety lawyer, the word safety and then the word lawyer all together, safetylawyer@gmail.com.
Sure.
And,
sure.
That gets me. I do have a website, www.safety-law.com, and that finds me too. But, I'm always happy to engage with people, talking about this because it is a passion of mine. I'm on LinkedIn too, so if anybody out there wants to connect up, go for it. And, I want to thank you really for bringing the attention to this issue, as well as, I want to say how much I enjoy working with you through the National Safety Council on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, as well as on broader safety and health issues. You're a real leader in this field, and I'm so pleased that you are doing this webcast, and honored to be part of this. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Adele. I'm honored to know folks like you who have already made such great contributions to safety in general, and continue to make contributions to make this it's if the workplace is a better place to be, the country's a better place. It just because they certainly go together. And so for those who've been listening in, that brings this conversation to a close. We'd certainly like to ask you to join us each Friday. A new episode drops. You can go to psychhealthandsafetyusa.com and the list is there. I've had folks call me and say, hey, what day do I have to listen in? What time? Just go on a Friday. There'll be something new. And it's certainly my honor. And thanks to the folks at Flourish DX who support this USA podcast. We are just really fortunate to be having this conversation. And again, to have great folks like you that are able to have the conversation with us. So until next episode, that's it for this conversation around psychological health and safety at the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.